Alright, so in this video we're going to see how to equip the player with some kind of object. So right now I have the player doesn't have a sword or anything. So the first thing to think about is like, why would the player get the object? There must have been some kind of an event that's making that happen. So I'm going to treat it like, I'm just going to do a on key down kind of thing. Just to make it easy, but you're probably doing more like a collides with or something like that. Or actually the way we could think about it is maybe colliding with that object. So what if we did have a sword object somewhere? So if we had one of these, and if you're using the Dragon World, sword is just part of the JSON. Doesn't need an area. Doesn't need to be solid. I might do origin bot for bottom. Alright, so there's a sword there, but the player doesn't really interact with it. But if the player collides with that sword, then something would happen. So player on collide, parens quote sword with something with the tag of sword, comma, arrow function. So what should happen then is that the sword starts to follow the player. That would be the key to the player kind of wearing that item. So we would need to say something like sword dot follow, but we don't have a variable for sword. So that's exactly where these parentheses come in, is to catch that as a parameter. So I'll call it S, sure. So then I can say something like S dot follow, and then I could just say to follow the player. All right, so it's not following the player yet. If I jump up, okay, interesting. I know I can call the follow component. All right, so it does work a little bit differently, but here's the solution to it. That there is, if you have an object, you can say .use, and that's a function that allows you to add a component later. So all the things that we list in these objects before, area, solid, origin, all that kind of stuff, if we want to kind of go back to that and add another component, well, that's what use does. And on the flip side, there is another, let's see if I can find this here. All right, so there's a use, and there's also an unuse that you can take away a certain component to. All right, so what that lets me do then is I can pass in the follow component to follow the player. So now that will add that component to the sword itself. So now the sword has a property to follow the player. Now the sword is sitting behind the player, which isn't exactly what we would like to see. So a good component for the sword here would be to just go ahead and give it a z index. So if I call the z function, and probably 1 is going to be good enough, then that will make it so that the sword is in front of other things that by default have a z index of 0. But then maybe the sword should be like off to the side a little bit. So this follow method can actually take two parameters. You can say, okay, to follow the player, but then you can also specify like an offset, like to follow it but be up a little bit or to the right a little bit. So you have to actually give it this thing called a vector. So you'd use the vec2 function, and that lets you say x and y. So if I did something like 10 comma 10, this is what it would look like. All right, so it moved it off a little bit. It moved it down in the y component, and it moved it to the right. So that's just where you would keep tinkering with what this should look like. Maybe it's more like on the y component, maybe -5. Actually raise the sword up a little bit, but off to the right because the player's kind of holding on to it. So this is where you just play around with these position numbers. But it's still going to follow the player wherever the player goes, but just be moved a little bit with that vec2 function. So that's how you do a pickup item.